this is a little bit kind of I won't say a shot in the dark, but it's kind of unusual because I don't know you and I obviously had never been in the cathedral before. I had Googled it and had a look and visited a few of your sites, but it's not the same thing as to appreciate. But as Anthony and through Maeve, I got an idea. One of the things is this idea that lots of places around the world are looking at is when we have kind of assets such as a beautiful cathedral, such a space in a city that doesn't have a lot, how do we think of that as something we can offer to the city and as a point of contact with the city? So that's the kind of thing. And what I'm going to do is a little bit of maybe, as far as you're concerned, off the wall, or it may have something relevant, but there'll be time for you to talk and to correct or add and to look at that. Just to give you a bit of the reason I began recently having to do a little bit of thinking about this is that the last year in Europe was designated the European Year of Cultural Heritage. And a lot of the debates were about things about what are the standing of the churches. And one of the issues that came out is a question that was kind of an unusual one was, who owns cultural heritage? Okay, we're trying to say we own it, we have to pay for it, we have to maintain it, we have to look after it. But what we have in a place like this, in a beautiful church, in the space around it, is something that was done with the money, the donations of the public, for religious purposes, but also to provide for the general well-being and good of a city and of the life of a city and of the civic realities of the city. So to some extent, there is that area of having a responsibility to ensuring that the public, the broader public, is able to appreciate what is here and make it, we're interested, of course, that it would speak a little bit about the truth of who we are and what our values are, but it's also something that we think can probably have something to say to everybody. One of the issues that was coming up for a while recently was this one: to what extent are churches relevant? We had a conference recently, big problem in, probably not so much in Australia, but a big problem in Europe and in North America, what to do with old churches, particularly churches that are now kind of way redundant in sense because there's no community living there, or there's not enough people of faith to maintain it. And how do we think about that connectivity? And one of the things we kept talking about, these as important public buildings, and that was quite a theoretical discussion until about a month or two ago, okay? When Paris, which is a rather secular city, you had this fire began in Notre Dame. And within the timing, I don't mean the timing was good, because it was an awful thing to happen, but from media, I used to work in communications, something that happens around 6 or 7 in the evening from a media perspective is perfect, because people have come home and suddenly, I would say every European TV station, the news was following what was happening to this absolutely magnificent cathedral. Everybody was highlighting the artistic value of the cathedral. But what was becoming very clear as people were covering the event was it was more than a museum, if that makes sense to you. People were gathering outside. I don't know if you saw the images here, because I know with the time difference, it probably didn't get as much live time. What? Loads later. And the issue that was coming up was people were gathering outside and were singing hymns, and they were saying prayers, and they were lighting candles. And I was watching it on Italian TV, and it's one of the stations that is very secular. And they had a French woman on who was saying, oh, this is the superstitious right, trying to make something of this. But it became very clear, even the people who were kind of inclined to be sympathetic said, no, this is something more. And one of the images that came to me is, to what extent, very often when we talk about it, I had already done it, the cathedral is at the heart of the city. And your cathedral is the heart of geographically. But to what extent could we think about it becoming, and we need to get this clear in our mind, becoming a soul for the city? Does that mean? And I have a lot of my work in the past was and to some extent still is with things about internet and social media. And Pope Benedict has this expression where he said, we should try to become, believers should try to give a soul to the internet. Now, he's not saying Catholics and believers are the only ones who have a soul and that somehow our presence. No, he's saying, how does the internet become a place where people can go a little bit deeper, not be afraid to reveal things about themselves, not simply stay at a superficial level. And one thing that could be interesting is if we take that image, to what extent could the cathedral and the space around it become opening up, giving a soul? Not necessarily now we're saying soul is a broader, but could it animate a city? Could it give life to a city? Could it create a space for people who mightn't be believers or mightn't have any great sense of commitment to the institution, but who pass by every day and at the minimum will probably become curious about what's behind the doors? And I think there's a possibility of thinking about that. What are the bridges that we might be able to build out to people? And what I'm trying to do is playing around with some of those themes. It's not a very put together talk that I'm absolutely sure where I'm going with it, but I do want to say, and having looked at it, I think some of the instincts you have are already very correct and right, which is one of the great bridges, I think, between religion and the world today is the area of art and beauty. And I can see that the quality of some of the carvings and the material you have there is stuff that will be accessible to people, it will appeal to people even who are not religious. So that becomes an important. I grew up in a small town near Dublin called Navan. And the church I was in had been built, I would say, in the 1800s. But in the 1940s, the then parish priest, it was long before I was born, obviously, but anyway, in the 1940s, the then parish priest had put up 4 extraordinarily large paintings of the 4 evangelists. But they were done not in your standard kind of format. This was a style of art that was quite popular in Ireland in the 1940s, which was trying to rediscover something of our Celtic tradition. The guy who did this did a lot of the Irish postal stamps at the time. You can see it's that kind of lithographic almost. But what I'm saying is, I'm not sure, does it really qualify as great art? But it meant the church was the place I encountered something very different. It's the first, Irish people tend to be quite realistic and we're not particularly into the arts and the imagination. Well, we are with literature and that, but in our day-to-day, we tend to be quite pragmatic. But this was an introduction into something that was extraordinary. In a small provincial town, you had these 4, and they're enormous. They're about 4 meters by 3 meters, and there's 4 of them, and they're sitting there. And it kind of introduced you to a notion of color, something that was exotic, something was different. And one of the things that I think we can try and think about using our churches as places that are a bit different for people, that are somewhat mysterious, that open them up to little rituals and to ideas that are a little bit strange and unusual, but that maybe touch hearts for people. So I just use this as an example of one that I think to some extent that and the encountering of the 4 images opened up a whole horizon for people about seeing things a little bit differently. This is, the next one though, this is one that I use. It's a poster for tours of Rome, and it's angels and demons. And one of the realities, every day there are thousands of people queuing up to go into St. Peter's. And I have no doubt that the majority of those people know more about angels and demons and Dan Brown than they know about the Gospels in any sense. That's not a lament, it's simply a reality. Is that the people who are coming in there, their image of who the church is and what's the church about, it's shaped by popular culture rather than our understanding of who we are. So I used the Dan Brown one, and it's frightening at times. If you walk around St. Peter's and listen in on guided tours, and you hear the stuff that's being said to people, you realize, God Almighty, this is bad. This is kind of worrying, because it's compounding, and people have this strange idea of the church. I'll tell you a very funny story, a true story that it's a friend of mine, a journalist, John Tighe, and he worked for Catholic News Service. And when John Paul II died, they selected 7 journalists to go in to see his body laid out. They were the pool. And then they had to come back to the 3,000 or 4,000 other journalists and say, this is what we saw, because you couldn't bring all the journalists in to see the body, so you get the pool. And John was in to see the body, and he came out and he stood before his American colleagues. So he said he met about 300 journalists in one room, and they asked him what was happening. He said, well, the Pope was buried. He was wearing priestly garments. He had a mitre on his head, and he was holding a crozier. Okay, it was grand, and John gave this, all fine. The following day, he sees a piece in one of the New York newspapers written by one of his colleagues who isn't particularly familiar with religion, and who said, the Pope was laid out in priestly clothing, he had a mitre, and he was holding a crow's ear. Okay? And this is the guy had, and he was in accordance with medieval custom. He had slightly embellished it. And now the other thing about it is, you have it in one. If the Pope had been holding a crow's ear, none of us would be the slightest surprise. The sort of thing that the church might be doing, and strange, Does that make? So what I'm trying to say is, what we have is this strange time we live in, where I think the context in which we're trying to, what is the mentality of most of the people who stroll across here? Some of them will be reading about the church and what they'll have read about the church in newspapers in Australia, as in Ireland, my own country, will not leave them terribly curious. There's one of the frightening things one of my nieces said to me recently a little bit, Paul, you have to realize you are the Nazis. Sorry, frightening. The church, the stories that are told in Irish thing at the moment, and the thing to some extent. So there is a negativity there, let's be honest. But more, I think there's just a religious illiteracy. Does that make? Yes. People, it's not true, and it's not, I want to be very careful, I'm not condemning, this is, if it's anyway, it's our fault. But people just don't really know what the stories are and what we're about and what we're doing. And it's primarily maybe a little bit what we might call kind of, I'm sure if it works for them, isn't it great? But we'll give them the free, it's not really my thing, it's a modern, but it's there, it's a reality. And people, though, may feel, well, it's nice and it's quiet and it's a green area where there's not many green areas, but fundamentally, there's not an understanding. So that's kind of the thing. And then I don't know Brisbane, but I've no doubt you have a lot of different religions, apart from the people who are kind of Christian and former Christian and that. You probably have a lot of other religions. So that's the context in which we live. And one way of talking about that, and it's a very interesting one, is that some people have begun to respond to it, to say, the kind of philosophical thing is to say it's postmodern. When it was modernism, everybody tried to argue that their theory was the right theory. So religion is the right way of seeing the world. No, atheism is the right way of seeing the world. Agnosticism is the only way. Science has all the answers. And people cared and argued. Postmodern is, well, whatever. Everybody, you're entitled to your view and go with it and run with it. And one of the things about the postmodern, it says is, and it's been an interesting, I'll just mention this because it's a background issue, the former head of the British Museum, a guy called Ian McGregor, who's a believer, but he's primarily an art historian who a very, very prestigious director of the British Museum and had a very successful time there. When he was leaving, he said, the last exhibitions I want to do is, he said, I'm very conscious for the first time ever in Britain, and some of what he's saying would probably apply in Australia as well, is he said, we don't have a shared story. We don't have shared beliefs. We don't have the same way of understanding our world and what our hopes are and what gives meaning. Everybody has their own story. And he said, Britain is the first really post-Christian society. And he said he wasn't interested in evangelizing per se, he said, but he said people are illiterate, they don't know. So he put on a really interesting exhibition called Living with the Gods. And he found art that has a religious dimension to it, starting thousands of years ago and ending about 3 weeks before the exhibition went on place. And he said, how do we help people, even if they're not religious or not going to be religious, to understand what religion was and what its points of reference were and why it might have had important things to say? He had an argument he made, which I think is very interesting. He said the only kind of continuing existing religious leftover, as far as he was concerned, in Britain, was Christmas. He says Christmas continues to work as a unifying feast day, even though he says most people have no idea. They might know the story, they might know the background to it, but it at least continues. And his view is, ultimately, he said, for most of its lifetime, he's talking past tense, he said religion was not so much about belief systems or morality. Religion gave people a way of living, a shared communal way of living that everybody knew where they fitted in, and it gave a coherence to society. And he says we have to think about that. Does that? So it's religion as a civic contribution was part of what he was on. Pope Benedict has a really interesting thing. When he went to visit St. Patricks Cathedral in New York, which is another kind of cathedral in the heart of a city, doesn't have the kind of grounds you have here, but it stands out. It's very different and has a huge number of people, although being in the American model, they charge in and they charge for every candle you light. And it's a tourist model, which is interesting, but I'm not sure how much it does other than the tourist model. And I think that's a nice thing about having a space that's free and open for people. But he went in and he saw the stained glass, and he said, if you look at stained glass from the outside, it makes absolutely no sense. You look from outside the building, it's kind of dull. He goes in and the light comes through it and it suddenly comes alive. And he said, that is the way we need to think about our faith. For believers, we go into a church or we have a faith and we see it with light. So it's like it comes alive and it speaks to us. But he says for people who are outside, it's dark, it just doesn't. So one of the things then he talked about is, he said, and I think it's the thing is, one of the things is, it means that, say, a lot of people who visit our churches and think of St. Peter's have no idea what it's about. So one way that we can engage people is if we explain and tell the story, not to convert them or to bombard them, but it will enhance their visit. So if Japanese tourists coming to St. Peter's has never heard of the cross, they don't know why it's built in the shape it is. So without being too heavy, now we've been arguing in culture in Rome that when people come to St. Peter's, because it's so many people coming through, there should be a little interpretation for them beforehand. Now, my worry is, knowing some of the people I work with, that'd be rather heavy. It'd be catechism classes before they got in. And I also remember I was visiting a church, a really interesting church in Mantua, which is up the north of Italy, and I had mom and dad with me. And like my mother now, if there's a coffee shop outside the church, that would be more interesting than, but she agreed to go into this one. But they had a tour guide who was giving lessons and really getting lessons and explaining religion to us. And my mother said, well, you just tell him we're Catholics and he doesn't need to, It does make it, And I do think, but one of the things we can do is to say that we can tell our story in a way that will enhance the person's. And one language that came up during the European year was to talk about this thing of access. We try and make all our buildings accessible for wheelchairs, for other forms of different abilities and things like that. We have hearing loops. We have all of that we work on. But fundamentally, it's unintelligible. So how do we think of access as a way of explaining some of what we are not primarily, we hope, and this is the thing, because we believe the churches such as this and the stories and the work that goes on, we're not built as museums. We're built to express a hope and a belief that maybe they can still talk to people much more effectively than we can. But so one of those ideas I would like to think is that we think about how we let what we have tell the story about the best of our story. And I think one of the ways we do that is at the heart of I'll come to it later, I'll leave it, but not bombarding people. And one of the things that I always say is how you can use digital devices to enhance the visit for people, so that people are walking around the church, and if they choose to, they can actually have an app very often. And some cathedrals are developing really good apps. That, in other words, the person can come and it opens up. It's up to them, do they want to linger? But they see a painting that they see as strange, and if they go home meaning to look it up, they won't. But if in the moment you have a way that opens it up and the artist here is trying to... one interesting thing I learned about that, we tried this with some of the Roman churches. We said, would you develop apps or would you allow them to be available? And I found, oh, no. Because our biggest source of revenue are the guidebooks we sell. so anyway, but I do think the app or something that can be an enhancement, and even little things, I would say, not just explanation, but one of the things I'm going to come to is some of the little rituals, without people having to engage with the deeper rituals. But one that is absolutely clear, and I'll read you a thing about it later, is this thing that people lighting a candle. People who have no belief, but have a worry, have a concern, the symbol of that begins to speak to them. So that's one line of thinking. So the context, we're in the middle of the heart of the city where lots of people, not necessarily hostile, but don't understand how do we make this a more meaningful engagement for them. That's one. I'll move to this one very quickly. One of the things that Pope Francis constantly talks about is encounter. And by encounter, he means that we meet people and we get to know each other at a slightly different level. And we get over our biases and our prejudice about the people we meet, and we try and open it up to a slightly different way. And he says the church should be, above all, a place, a community that is happy to encounter others. We're on the same journey. We're same struggles in life as other people. We're not exempt. We're not better. We have a hope that is important to us. And how can we journey with people, listening to them, hearing their stories, giving them an opportunity to share their difficulties, and in a way that we're going to, the key word is, we're not going to do that exploitatively. We're not going to try and sell them something at the end. We're not going to bounce them into a conversion or an RCI program before they know where they are. No, if that happens, extraordinary, great, and we certainly welcome that, but the person's pace. And this is the big thing about Pope Francis has, and I think he wants us to think about what are the places of encounter that we have. So you have a church, you have a space around it, lots of people coming through, and I'm sure there are people walking across here every morning who are worried about something at home. Yes. I'm sure there are people who are walking through here who are dreading going into work. Yes. Dreading it. Yes. I'm sure there are people coming across here who have a doctor's appointment and are wondering where that's, so they're the drama ones. But then there's the nicer ones. There's somebody who has a birthday, has a celebration, has a nice, but to help those people, and most of those people, there's nowhere anybody's interested in what they are about. Okay, they have their family, but increasingly families are quite fragile, or you'll have a lot of people. I've no doubt in Brisbane, I'm thinking of lots of young Irish who are a long way from home, who certainly won't be overly invading your churches, but they still have some. So it's try and think about that. And the word Pope Francis has is this thing of encounter. And he also strongly, if you encounter and you get to know people, or they get to understand or see a little bit more, one of the things we can offer is try and explain what our faith means to us. Not in a pushy way, but look, I find this helpful, or I find this supportive, or when I have a problem, this has been, and if it's authentic and if it's real, then it will speak to people. So how do we find a way of talking? This is the idea Pope Francis has. How do we share? It's not that we're selling anything, but sharing is, people are happier with sharing than they are with mission, I think, nowadays. We share beliefs that are important to us. How would we think about? And he said, that'll only happen if our own faith actually means something. If we have a sense that this has been, it's been a strength to me, and I know it can be a strength for others. And I'll leave that, I'll move along because I want to go to your questions in a moment and get into the more side tomorrow. I think beauty is a thing that will speak to people. And the bridge between so many people, that one of the things that is, if we get people trying to talk about what you believe and what you don't believe, no great appetite for it. If you get into the thing of how should I behave or should I not behave, they don't want us telling us anything like that. Third way, traditionally, of encountering was in and through beauty. So the via pulchritudinus is it's the way of beauty. And things that are beautiful and that are good can speak to people to the heart. And Pope Benedict, and again, I won't hit you too much of this, but Pope Benedict was very strong on that good art can silence you. It makes you see things a bit differently. It stops you. It shocks you is one of the things. He said, most people are trapped in a kind of, busy, and suddenly they said, wow, he said, is really good art. And that, he said, is beginning of all. Kind of wondering, creating a stillness, and he said, art, like religion, they're absolutely connected to each other. He has this lovely motif where he talks about art at its best opens the door right up to what is not visible. It kind of yearning. Here's a little image I want you to use. This is from the front of the cathedral in Orvieto, which is a lovely place, about an hour and a half, or an hour and 20 minutes if you drive like I do, north of Rome. And there's extraordinary carving, and this is a carving of a baptism. And Seamus Heaney, Irish poet, which all Irish people have to quote regularly. It's almost compulsory, but at least I'll quote the poems you haven't heard before. Seamus Heaney said, if you look at it, you see extraordinary detail. And he describes the detail he sees in it. The water rippling, there's little fish in the water, there are animals. But then he said, there's something more going on. And he says, it's complete visual reference. Okay, it's for your eyes. But he said, in that utter visibility, the stone's alive with what's invisible. And this is better, I think, than Pope Benedict could put it. He has it. Art it's something more going on, and it opens that up for us. And I think that's an important thing for us. Why does that happen? Because all human beings, whether they know it or not, this is my little bit of theology, for very simple, and probably wrong, as I realize I have a theologian in the room. But anyway, my instinct is every human person was made in the image and likeness of God. And whether we know it or not, or whether we believe it or not, as far as we're concerned, it doesn't matter. Every person was made in the image and likeness of God. And at one level, that's why we have to treat well and care for everybody. But at another level, I think it means every human person, precisely because they're made in the image and likeness of God, there's something in them that will resonate, that will, when they see goodness and they see beauty and they hear a nice story, despite everything, it'll resonate. And one of the things we want to do is to say is that when are human beings most like God? When they share in God's creative abilities, when the artists are inspired, because the inspiration word itself is coming from the Spirit. So let's look at the thing of how really good art can touch, and it's going to touch people's hearts because that's the way they're wired. Gratuity is another one. And when you think about art, I'm not an art specialist, but last year I had to do a fair bit of work on this theme. And one of the talks I had to give was in New York. And I was in a taxi going for the talk. I was sitting in the taxi looking at all the buildings in New York, which is one of my favorite cities. But all the buildings are decorated. They're all decorated. There's carvings, there's images, there's twists and turns that are not functional. Like if you know the way a child draws a house is straight. And there are certain architects, that's the way they do their buildings. But most want to, there's something more that's not functional. And that's kind of, art is gratuitous. It's not necessary. You don't need art in your life. You'll be able to reach it, but your soul may not be alive. So this idea of gratuity, and therefore, and at a very real level, I want to push that slightly more, is that you're in a world where nothing is gratuitous. You pay for everything. So if we can offer to people something that is gratuity, that is really beautiful and well done. This again is from a church in France, Autun, and it's carving on a small scale that in the original church you couldn't see because they were so high up, they were on top of the pillars and and yet the artist put everything, that time it would have been a he, but artists put everything they have, he or she, they're the only ones who know, have I really given my best to this? Because it's not for earning, it's not for, I know that it was my best. And that we try and do, we offer something to people that's gratuitous, that there's no agenda going on. Pope Francis, who isn't the strongest one on art and beauty, not that he appreciates it, but he refuses to go to concerts because, and I've seen him once, we had an event, we brought one of the world's great pianists in. He said, 4 minutes, no more than 4 minutes now. I'm not sitting for it. And he's sitting there, and I swear, thank God the public did. Ask the guy, it was a magnificent piece. He begins looking at the watch. Now, that is, I think he loves music, he loves art, but he's not comfortable to be watched watching, if that makes sense. But he's not so art and beauty, we're not, we realize that we're looking for money for a new art exhibition. He'd be saying, well, what about the poor and that's no harm. But the art, I think, but he does have a thing in Laudato Si, where he talks about the environment. And he says, if people learn to appreciate beauty, then they won't want to destroy it. Whereas if everything is functional, then we end up with the way we're treated. So he's there. This is a little quote from Philip Larkin, the English poet, who wrote a magnificent poem called Church Going. And in it, he's talking about a church and there's nobody in it and nobody believes and it's all over and it's gone. And then he imagines who will be the last person ever to come into this strange building. And he has this wonderful ending to the poem, which I think captures something. And he says, there'll always be somebody wandering through what he imagines might be the ruins of the church. But somebody, and he says, a serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies. And that much can never be obsolete. And he says, someone will forever be surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious. The people who mightn't, but there are people, we use the language sometimes, the searchers. We've all met, I'm really going to be deep. I'm not particularly sympathetic to self-identifying searchers who really want to, sorry, that's lack of sympathy. But there are people, I think everybody's a searcher, but they're not comfortable. They don't have the language to name it. But they're looking for something a bit deeper at times, and maybe that can bring them in to where we are and what we're doing. So anyway, back, a culture of encounter, and I'm just going to run through this very quickly with some ideas of things I've been traveling that I see have worked in different places. Sorry. Culture of encounter. Okay, one of the images, I'll just do this very quickly, that I picked up, the guy who runs the stained glass windows cathedral north of Paris, Chartres. The guy who runs Chartres, which is one of the most beautiful churches in the world, says that in Chartres they have a mission. And their mission is that all the people who come for the art, he wants them to become pilgrims. And it's a very famous devotional spot. And he said, all the people who are coming on pilgrimage to see the images of Mary, I want them to learn and see the beauty of the art. Does that make? And a church becomes a place of encounter. Another image is the tourists. Okay, you wouldn't have necessarily tourists, but you probably would have tourists. This is one of the older buildings of the city. Guidebooks say it's a thing. And a lot of those people, they're coming because the book said it's something to see. Can we have something that might surprise them? There's an interest. They're coming into the door of the church, which is not a major problem in the church nowadays of too many people coming in. They're coming in with a little bit of curiosity. They may have things going on, and even though they're not going to be, they're searching. Even the stillness of this environment, often, particularly in London, if you're visiting London, it's a busy, churches are these little spots of stillness. It's probably one of the few places that's not charging them. Hospitality. The old idea of church is sanctuary. You can sit quietly there, and in some cases that may be somebody who's sheltering from rain or somebody who's homeless. It can be but it's sanctuary. And then we allow maybe that we find a way of introducing them to some of our little rituals. I think the one that I'm going to keep coming back to, this idea of the candle. Think of a prayer, leave an intention, write a worry, but something that invites them into something a little bit more. Then one of the things we can do is think about the art we fill our churches with. And your crucifixion, I've just seen it, but that's an extraordinary, powerful and beautiful piece. And I can see you're around the baptismal, you're using art, and take the risk of going with something that's a bit new. Now, some cathedrals are also saying one of the things is music. Music from our tradition for concerts, but even a little thing, a number of churches now leave something like a very light Tighe music playing quietly, so it creates a little stillness or quiet. So it's a way of making this slightly more for it. I'll leave the creating of heritage. In some ways, let's do a bit of new stuff that might in time become warm for people. Then the key questions, as I see it, is who are your neighbors here? Who are the people? Who are they? What are their worries? What are their concerns? And where do we begin with that? One of the things that we do is that, for example, in Westminster, it's very close to the business area of London. And they've started having regular meetings looking at issues about banking, investment, and ethics, and inviting people because they know that passing through and by them every day are people working in that area. And they do it not in a preachy way, but we'd like to learn from you. What are the issues? So who are our neighbors? The courtyard of the Gentiles, I've been mentioning this before, but it's a thing that Pope Benedict used. Have any of you heard of the courtyard of the Gentiles? Yeah, right. Well done. Courtyard of the Gentiles was in Jerusalem. The Jews had the temple, and only the Jews could go into the temple. That was their place of prayer. But there was a big square outside, a precinct, if you want to call it that, where they had to meet all the people of the city. And they considered the Gentiles, the non-Jews, were, as far as they're concerned, the pagans or the non-believers. But they had to share the same city. They had to decide good sanitation. How do we keep it secure for our children? How do we make sure the buildings are safe? How do we prevent fire spreading? Which are the kind of common things we have to agree. And the courtyard of the Gentiles was where that happened. So Pope Benedict said, let's think about the church. We have our space, which is often behind the door off the square. And that's great, and we open that door as best we can. But we think about how we engage with people who are different about shared interests. So the courtyard of the Gentiles is this idea that you do something which brings together people who identify as believers and people who would say, we're not believers. Self-identity, nobody's putting them in boxes, their choice. And they come to talk about interest. One of the things we're clear, not coming to talk about why I believe and why you don't believe and why you're wrong and I'm right and why, no. Talk about education. Talk about environment. Talk about issues that we all share, and we bring different perspectives, and that ultimately the different perspectives could be enriching rather than in competition. So we had one recently, an extraordinary one that I didn't know, the professor of physics in a university down in Sicily, who is not a believer, but who is one of the world's greatest physicists working on light, understanding light and the qualities of light and the science of light, said, I want to have a courtyard of the Gentiles, and I want to hear what artists think about light, and why our light is a religious image. And we're not, because as far as he's concerned, light is spectrums, and it's molecules, and it's neutrons, and it's all of that. But he said, that's not, I'm not seeing the full picture. And it entered this extraordinary kind of thing where people began to say, well, yeah, you know, he'd be a university that's traditionally identified as places where religion doesn't get much of an entry. But it's, so that idea of a courtyard of the Gentiles. The other ones I want to talk about are just ones I've seen and I think are brilliant. One is the Stations of the Cross have been developed by art historians in London to begin with, rolled out subsequently in Washington, and most recently in Amsterdam. And the guy who runs this project is Jewish, Aaron Rosen, professor of art, before in London, now in Montana. He's the world's greatest expert on contemporary art and spirituality. And he wants to engage the public. So what he came up in London, and similar was, he said, okay, Easter week, the 14 Stations of the Cross. And he says, there's a beautiful number one, we'll go into Westminster Cathedral, and we'll see the beautiful number one done by, I forget the Spencer, or Gill, which is a famous set of sculptures. Then we're going to go out, and I've asked a contemporary artist to think about station number two. And if my mother had brought me up rightly, I'd be able to remember what 1, 2, and 3, and 4 are, but anyway, I won't. And number 3, we're back into, there's an Anglican church, has a lovely station. Then we're going to walk on, and the British Museum have a lovely number 4. Somewhere else is a 5. I wanted an agnostic Jew to do number 6, and he created a walkway through the city with all sorts of traditional, different, and it's an art pilgrimage, he calls it. This is, and I have the website here, you can see it. It's extraordinary pieces. This is one done by an atheist person and hung up in the middle of a church, and kind of engaging people. And the beauty of it was, you had people who went because they're interested in the arts and know nothing about religion. You had other people who are interested in religion with very little knowledge of the arts, and it gets them thinking together. Does that make? And if you have a city here, you know, you can modify it, but there's lots of interesting things around. I don't know if you have, in Ireland we have a thing called Culture Night, where all the museums stay open all night. And some of the churches say, we'll open as well, and we'll highlight, we have a wonderful choir, and we'll have them singing. And the public that's out wandering around from place to place, which would never come into a church, walks in that day. So that's one. Another one is, and this one, the Vatican does Venice has a biennale. It's all about abstract art and difficult art, but every second year it's on architecture. And reality, the reason with this is we couldn't afford to do the one on contemporary art this time. We couldn't get the money to do it. Somebody said, would you not do architecture? The church has always been in the business of working with architects. And I'll be honest, the guy who came up with the idea was brilliant, but he never really quite told us how much it was going to cost, and we're still trying to pay for it. And sorry, that's the administrator and me worrying now at this stage. But what they came up with was the idea of these, you can't see them that well, 10 of the world's best architects, including Norman Foster, Mauro, who's you learn a lot in my job. The Pritzker Prize is the Nobel Prize of Architecture. So 2 of these people had won Pritzkers, and a few of them will win it. And there was a Japanese non-religious guy. There was an Australian, a guy called Sean Godsell, works out of Melbourne. So I say Norman Foster, some Italian, young, really spectacular one, young Brazilian woman. And they were always just said, think about if you were designing a chapel, you have to keep it small, what would you do? And they went the most extraordinary different things, and they built them. And what it was it got people thinking about what are churches for? It's a place for people to be quiet. It's a place for people to gather. It's for people to have an encounter with something more than themselves. Some of them are not believers. Some of them were little images they had. The Japanese guy had incorporated the thing from Japanese tradition where his chapel had a very narrow door. And the narrow door was you couldn't go in with your sword on. So it was a place of peace. So they all, and the different cultures and the enriching of that, really, and I'm sorry I can't show you more of the details of that. This is one is a video piece by a guy called Bill Viola, who really is one of the more interesting people working. And he's talking about martyrdom, and he's doing it in the context of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And he's thinking of where people today are suffering for their faith, which might be faith in human rights or faith in justice. And he has this extraordinary living video piece. Again, I have the links to it here afterwards. You can see the piece, and you can see him explaining it. And what it is, it's very different, but it actually talks very strongly to people. So that's what I'm saying is one of the things is to think about commissioning new pieces. Putting up maybe, I know you do some of that already, but competitions which get people doing something and reflecting about it. And then I'm going to finish on my own favorite collection. This is an Irish guy called Sean Scully. He's recognized as one of the contemporary, in the sense that he sells for about 2 to 3 million, every one of his works. So it puts you, it's not just me thinks it's nice, and I unfortunately won't be buying any of them either. And the monks in Montserrat is the abbey near Barcelona, have a contemporary art collection. And they wanted to buy one of his pieces, or they said if we bring him over, he might even give us a present of one of the pieces, and Scully goes over, and he says, yeah, he was interested. Then they showed him an old chapel they had, 12th century chapel, Romanesque chapel, empty, falling to pieces. And he said, God, I'd like to fill that. And he says, what I want to do is bring light and beauty into it. Now he claims he's not a believer, but I wish we had more non-believers like him, because he's absolutely, and it's a tribute to his faith, he said, came from his grandmother, from his parents. He has this extraordinary piece, which I'll send a link to it, but it's where he's interviewed, and he says, where did your artist imagine it? He said, he moved from Ireland to England. He said, I started in a Catholic school. And then my parents had a fight with the nuns, and I ended up in the state school. Good Irish story. And he said, even at 8, I found it devastating. Because he said, I went from a reality that was full of mystery, that was full of stories. And I went into something where everything was functional. It had to be the way it was. And he has this sense of, the church had given him this sense of art. And he talks about sitting in an old church in London, which had been built for the Irish community, with a galvanized roof, listening to the rain drilling on it, looking at the Stations of the Cross and seeing color. And he said, I realized I never wanted to live in a dull world. And that's an artist, what I want to do is affirm. And that's what he does. Everything he does with light. So you can see some of his work here. More of his stuff is, and it's abstract, but it's working. This is the mystery one. Just a pure, and this is one across, which he has again done. And it's the iron, the nails are wrapped in the glass. And it's how the transformation, just the one that was there earlier, I'll just leave it with it because it's, I think my favorite of them all is this one, which is the Stations of the Cross. The 14 Stations of the Cross, and it's called Holly because that was his grandmother's name. And he says, what I see in this all the time is that the light, there was darkness, there was light, and it's coming together. So that's all I have to say to you, and just get you thinking and see what your ideas might be. And I'm sorry, I hope that was somewhat relevant anyway. Thank you.